Part 1, when storms come knocking on the coldest night of 1887, with the Colorado blizzard howling like something alive and furious outside her cabin walls, Elara Whitfield held a pitchfork in both hands and stared into the shadows of her barn at a stranger large enough to break her in half and made the decision that would either save her life or end it. Stay with me until the very last word. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Want to see how far this story travels. The wind came first the way it always did on the high plains, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once as though the sky had been holding its breath for days and simply let go. Elara felt it before she heard it, a vibration in the walls of the cabin, a trembling in the floorboards beneath her feet, and then the sound itself, a long rising wail that climbed into something primal, something that bypassed reason and went straight for the oldest part of the human brain, the part that remembered when darkness meant death. She pressed her shoulder harder against the cabin door, though she knew it was already latched. She did it anyway because her body needed something to push against something that felt like resistance. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the wood with a sound like a fist. Snow forced its way through the gaps in the frame, dusting the floor in white powder that melted into dark, wet stains on the weathered planks. 3 months. That was how long Robert had been in the ground. 3 months since the plow horse had gone sideways on the frozen slope and come down on him with its full weight. 3 months since she had sat at his bedside for 2 days, listening to the sound his lungs made and praying for it to stop, not because she wanted him gone exactly, but because the waiting was its own kind of cruelty. 3 months since she had become a widow at 23 years old alone on 40 acres of failing Colorado plains, with debts she could not pay, in a winter that showed no sign of ending. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. She knew she needed to add wood. She'd been telling herself that for an hour. But the wood pile was on the far side of the cabin close to the window, and every time she moved toward it, she remembered how low it was getting, and her chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Her stomach made a sound that she had stopped being embarrassed by weeks ago. Hunger had become her constant companion, patient and insistent as a creditor, waiting on the front steps. Dinner had been the last of the dried corn she'd been stretching, with water fried in the remnants of lard she'd been rationing since November. Tomorrow there would be nothing. The storm had been building since early afternoon, and now the night had closed around the cabin like a fist, and getting to town was not a possibility she could afford to consider. She was going to die here. Not tonight, most likely. Not this week. But the mathematics of her situation were simple, and they had only one answer. The land was failing. The mortgage was past due. Her livestock was down to 1 milk cow and a dozen chickens, and even those she could feel slipping away from her with each cold week that passed. She was 23 years old, and she was going to starve to death, or freeze to death, or lose the farm to the bank and end up doing something she did not want to think about in one of the mining towns. The realization sat in her chest like a stone, heavy, cold, certain. Then came the bang. It came from the direction of the barn, sharp and loud enough to be heard over the wind. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. She moved to the window, wiped the frost from the glass with the heel of her hand, and pressed her face close. The barn was barely visible through the white chaos, a dark shape swimming in and out of focus behind the curtains of driving snow. She couldn't tell if the door was open or closed. She couldn't tell anything. Another bang, then silence, then another rhythmic and hard. The barn door. She had latched it herself before sunset had checked it twice because she knew what these plains storms could do. But the wind tonight was something else. She could feel it in the way the cabin walls trembled, in the way the smoke from the hearth was being pulled backward down the chimney. "Damn it," she said. The curse felt strange in her mouth. Robert had never allowed it. Robert had never allowed much of anything. She pulled her coat from its peg by the door, the one that had been his before she'd taken it over out of necessity, wrapped her scarf around the lower half of her face, shoved her hands into gloves that were more whole than fabric. Then she opened the door, and the blizzard hit her like a physical thing, like a wall of cold that stole the breath from her lungs and nearly knocked her backward into the cabin. The barn was 30 yards. She had walked it 1,000 times. She bent her head into the wind and began. The snow was knee-deep already and deepening by the minute. Robert's boots, 2 sizes too large, filled with powder, immediately melting against her wool socks, and her feet went from cold to numb within the first 10 steps. She could not see more than a few feet in any direction. The world had been reduced to white noise and the smell of ice and the burning sensation of frost on her exposed cheeks. She was halfway there when she stumbled over something buried in the snow, a bucket maybe, or a fence post blown loose. She went down hard on her hands and knees, and the impact drove the air from her body in a long, painful rush. For a moment, she just knelt there, gasping, the snow piling against her back with patient determination. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up or die here." She got up. The barn materialized out of the storm like something from a dream, dark and solid and real. The door was hanging open, banging against the frame with each gust. Elara grabbed it with both hands and hauled it closed, working the latch with fingers that had lost all feeling. Inside out of the wind, the silence was so sudden it felt like a physical shock. Bessie stood in her stall, eyes rolling white with fear, but on her feet. The chickens were huddled together on their roosts, puffed up to twice their normal size. Both alive, both intact. Elara let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She was about to turn back toward the cabin when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Breathing, low and rhythmic, coming from the shadows at the far end of the barn, near the hay piled against the back wall. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Her mind ran through the possibilities in the space of a heartbeat. A wolf, maybe. A mountain lion driven down from the high country by hunger. She had no gun. Robert had sold it 2 years ago to cover a debt, and she'd never had the money to replace it. She had nothing but her bare hands, in a body already hollowed out by months of insufficient food. Her eyes found the pitchfork leaning against the near wall. She took it, without thinking, both hands gripping the handle, and faced the shadows. "I know you're there," a voice said. Elara did not scream. She was too startled for screaming. The voice was human, low and rough as gravel, and it came from the deepest part of the shadows. And for a moment, she simply could not process it. Not an animal, a man. A man in her barn was worse than any predator. "Show yourself," she said. The steadiness of her own voice surprised her. Movement in the dark. A figure unfolded from the shadows, and he was large, larger than she had imagined from the voice alone. Well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to take up the entire back of the barn. Snow clung to his coat and his hat and melted in rivulets down a face she could barely make out. His hands were raised, palms out, in a gesture that was either peace or surrender. "I mean no harm, ma'am." The voice again, tired rather than threatening. "My horse is done in. I saw the light from the road and hope to shelter here until the storm passes. I'll be gone by morning. You won't know I was here." Elara kept the pitchfork pointed at the center of his chest. Up close, she could see more of him. Younger than she'd thought from the weathered look of him, maybe 30, with a heavy beard and eyes that were bruised dark with exhaustion. His coat was good quality, but worn thin at the elbows. His boots were caked with ice. In the corner behind him, barely visible in the dim light of the single lantern, a massive bay horse stood with its head hanging low, sides heaving with labored breath. "This is my property," she said. "You're trespassing." "Yes, ma'am, I know, and I apologize for it." His hands stayed raised, his movements careful and deliberate, like a man very aware of how large he was and how much fear that size could cause. "But my horse—" He glanced back at the animal, and something in his expression shifted, softened with something that looked like genuine pain. "He can't go further tonight. I'm just asking for shelter for him. I'll sleep in the snow if I have to." "You'll die in the snow, maybe." He lowered his hands slowly. "That's my problem, not yours." She should say no. Every ounce of sense she had said no. Every story her mother had ever told her about women alone on homesteads and what happened to them said no. She looked at the man, at his careful hands, his exhausted eyes, his deliberate stillness, and then she looked at the horse. The animal was trembling. Its legs shook with each breath it took. The foam at the corners of its mouth had gone cold. She had seen horses work to the edge before. She knew what that edge looked like, and this horse was standing on it. She had lost enough. The thought came quietly, without drama. She had lost Robert and the future she'd imagined and the life she'd thought she was building. She had lost her health and her comfort and most of her food and very nearly her hope. But she had not yet lost the thing inside her that recognized suffering and could not simply turn away from it. "The barn," she said finally. "You can stay in the barn. There's hay in the loft, water in the trough. You touch anything else, you come near the cabin, and I will shoot you." She didn't have a gun, He didn't need to know that. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me. Stay in the barn. She backed toward the door, keeping the pitchfork between them, her eyes on his face. He didn't move, didn't follow. Just stood there with his hands at his sides and watched her with those careful, exhausted eyes. She slipped out into the storm and pulled the door closed. The trip back to the cabin was worse than the trip out. The wind had climbed another register in her absence, and the snow was deeper now, piling against every fixed surface. She lost her direction twice, wandering in white circles, before she spotted the faint glow of the cabin window and corrected her course. By the time she reached the door, her hands had gone from numb to something past numb, and her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Inside, she stripped off her wet things with shaking fingers and huddled over the dying fire, wrapping every blanket she owned around her shoulders. Her teeth chattered so hard, she thought they might crack. It was a long time before the shaking stopped, and longer still before she could feel her feet again. She had been a fool to go out in that storm, a fool to check the barn, and a fool to talk to the stranger, and a fool possibly to let him stay. Any one of those decisions could have gotten her killed. But the horse was still trembling in her memory, its legs shaking with each labored breath, and she could not have sent them away. She simply could not. Elara added the last of the good firewood to the fire and pulled her knees to her chest and watched the flames catch and grow. Outside, the blizzard screamed its fury at the world. Inside, she sat alone in her dead husband's cabin, wearing his oversized coat, and tried not to think about the man sleeping 30 yards away in her barn, how large he'd been, how still he'd held himself, how carefully he'd kept his hands in sight. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire with the pitchfork within reach and watched the door, and listened to the storm and counted the hours until morning. 10. Dawn came late and gray, the sun nothing but a pale rumor behind a sky that had forgotten how to be anything but heavy. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world so transformed it seemed like a different place entirely. The snow had come up to the windows on the north side of the cabin. Drifts shaped like frozen waves cut across the property. The barn was still standing at least. She could see that much from the window. She dressed in everything she owned, 2 pairs of socks, 2 shirts, her coat over all of it, and stood in front of the cold hearth taking stock. No food, no firewood worth speaking of. No way to reach town until the roads were broken, which could take days. A stranger in her barn who might be anything at all. Smoke was rising from between the boards of the barn. He'd built a small fire. That was her hay, burning her property being used without her permission, but he'd asked for shelter, and she'd given it, and a deal was a deal, even one made under duress. She needed to milk Bessie, needed to collect eggs, needed to assess whatever damage the storm had done. The stranger would just have to tolerate her presence in her own barn. The path between the cabin and the barn, 30 yards she had walked 1,000 times, was now an exhausting wade through powder so deep and soft that she sank with every step. She was breathing hard and sweating despite the cold by the time she reached the door, and she paused with her hand on the latch to steady herself before pushing it open. He was exactly where she'd left him. He was sitting on a bale of hay near his horse, a small fire burning in a ring of stones he'd arranged on the dirt floor. The fire was carefully sized, small enough to be controlled, placed away from the hay, vented toward the gap at the top of the barn wall. He'd been thoughtful about it. She hadn't expected that. He rose when she entered, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose body had been pushed too hard and knew it. "Morning, ma'am." She didn't answer. She moved past him to Bessie's stall, fetched the milk pail and the stool, and sat down to the familiar work. The warm smell of milk and hay filled her nose. Something in her chest loosened slightly. This was normal. Whatever else was happening, this was normal. Behind her, she could hear him moving, the soft sounds of someone tending to a horse. She focused on the rhythm of the milking, the steady streams hitting the pail on anything except the fact of him being there. "I'm sorry about the fire." His voice came from behind her, and she kept her hands moving, not allowing herself to startle. "I know it's your hay. I'll pay you for it once I reach town. Send money back." "Don't bother," Elara said. "I won't be here to receive it." A pause. "You're leaving, one way or another." She finished milking, stood and carried the pail to the shelf. Not much milk. Bessie was suffering in the cold, her production cut to barely a quart. Elara turned to face the stranger properly for the first time in daylight. He looked worse than he had the night before. His face was windburned, his lips chapped and raw, but his eyes were clearer now, more focused, taking in the barn and her with equal attention. They were dark. She saw a deep brown, steady and careful, the kind of eyes that missed very little. "You have a name?" she asked. "Declan Marsh." He offered it without hesitation, which she took as a small point in his favor. People with something to hide usually hesitated. "I was heading north. Heard there was ranching work in the territory above Larimer County." "Elara Whitfield." She said it before she decided to, then made herself continue. "This was my husband's homestead. He died in October. It's mine now, along with everything he owed." "I'm sorry." He said it simply, without the awkward overlay of pity that most people couldn't help adding. "Are you—" The bitterness was in her voice before she could stop it. "Most people in this county are just watching to see when I'll give up the property." He didn't argue. He just looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and she felt uncomfortably that he was seeing more than she'd intended to show him. She turned away and checked the chickens. 3 eggs. Better than nothing. When she looked back, Declan was saddling his horse, his movements efficient despite the stiffness she could see in his back and shoulders. The animal was steadier this morning, alert, tracking her movements, standing on solid legs. Rest had helped him. "Your barn roof is damaged," Declan said without looking at her. "North corner. Looks like a section of shingles went into the storm. You'll get snow coming in if you don't patch it." Elara's jaw tightened. Of course. Of course something else had broken. "I'll deal with it," she said. "You have a ladder tall enough, tools." "I said I'll deal with it." He turned to face her then, and whatever she'd expected to see, be impatience, condescension, the particular expression men wore when they thought a woman was being foolishly stubborn, wasn't there. What she saw instead was something that looked unsettlingly like recognition. "I know what it's like," he said, "to be too proud to take help when you're drowning. I've been there, but pride doesn't patch a roof." He paused. "Let me fix it. In exchange for the shelter, we call it even and I ride out today. You don't owe me anything. Maybe I want to do something decent before I move on." Elara studied him. Something in his directness disarmed her. Not charming, not persuasive, just plain and blunt, and apparently honest. She thought of the roof. She'd been avoiding looking at the damage for 2 weeks, hoping it would hold through the winter. She already knew it wouldn't. "I have a ladder in the lean-to," she said finally. "Scrap lumber under the snow on the east side, no pay to offer." "I'm not asking for pay." "Then what are you asking for?" He paused, seeming to genuinely consider the question. "To stop feeling like I take from the world without ever putting anything back." She opened her mouth and closed it again. It was the most disarming thing he could possibly have said, because it required no response she could think of. "Fix the roof," she said, "then go." She watched him from the cabin window. She told herself she was watching because it was her barn and her roof, and she had a right to know what was happening to her property. She told herself she was watching because she didn't trust him yet, not entirely, because trust was something you built slowly with evidence, and this man had been on her property for less than 12 hours. She did not tell herself that she was watching because she hadn't seen another person in 3 weeks, and the simple fact of human movement, of someone working with focus and competence and care in the space she could see, felt like medicine against a loneliness she'd been trying not to acknowledge. Declan Marsh worked like a man who had been doing physical labor his whole life. He'd found the ladder in the lean-to, located the scrap lumber under its blanket of snow, and climbed to the roof with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom heights held no particular drama. From the window, she could see him examining the damage, running his hands along the boards, assessing before he committed to anything. Thoughtful. She turned away from the window and made herself useful. Rationed the beans she had left, measured the flour, tried to calculate how long she could make it last if she was careful. The numbers were not encouraging. If the road stayed blocked for more than a week, and they could in February on this stretch of the plains, she would run out of food before she could reach town. She had made her choices. She had married Robert Whitfield when she was 19 because the alternative was destitution. She had worked his land and kept his house and tried to make something livable from a situation that had never been comfortable. She had stayed after his death because the farm was all she had left, even failing, even mortgaged to the hilt, even impossible. She had stayed because giving up felt too much like dying, and she was not ready to die. The sound of the hammer on the barn roof was oddly comforting. She stood in front of her cold stove and listened to it, the steady, rhythmic knock of someone repairing something, and felt against all logic slightly less alone. Then the sound stopped. She was at the window before the thought had fully formed. The ladder was still against the barn wall. The scrap wood was still in its pile, but Declan was not on the roof. He was on the ground. She was through the door and running before she'd made any decision to do so, and the snow slowed her to a stumble, But she kept moving, crossing the 30 yards in what felt like minutes, reaching him, where he lay on his back in the snow with his eyes closed and his face the color of old ash. She dropped to her knees, put her hand to his chest, felt it rise and fall. "Declan," her voice was sharp. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, unfocused, then steadying. "Sorry," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Just dizzy. Give me a moment." "When did you last eat?" He blinked, seemed to genuinely need to think about it. "I'm not certain." "Lord above." She got her arms under his shoulders. "You have to help me. I can't carry you." He found the strength from somewhere. She could feel how much it cost him, and together they staggered upright. He was enormously heavy, all of it bone and muscle, and she was not a large woman. But she had been doing physical work for years, and she set her feet and leaned into it, and they managed the 30 yards back to the cabin somehow, and she got him through the door and into the chair by the cold hearth. He sat with his head hanging, his elbows on his knees, breathing in careful, measured pulls. Elara stood over him. Her heart was hammering. Her pot of beans was on the stove, the thin, inadequate soup she'd been planning to stretch over 3 days. She looked at it and made herself not think about what she was giving up. She added more water, threw in her last tablespoon of flour to thicken it, poured half her morning milk into a cup. "Drink this," she said, pressing the cup into his hands. He looked at her. "That's yours. Drink it or I'll pour it down your throat." He drank. His hands shook so badly he had to hold the cup with both of them. She watched the color come back into his face gradually, like a fire catching. "You're an idiot," she said. "Working all day without food. What did you think would happen?" "I'm used to it." He raised his head. "I'm usually fine." "You are very obviously not fine." She ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table in front of him. It was terrible soup, barely more than thin-flavored water, and she was ashamed of it even as she set it down. "Eat." He looked at the bowl, then at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "This is everything you have." "Eat," she said again. He ate. She sat across from him with her arms folded and her back straight and watched him take careful, measured spoonfuls that grew steadier as his body remembered how to receive food. She did not allow herself to think about the fact that she was hungrier than he was. She did not allow herself to think about tomorrow. "Why are you doing this?" he asked when the bowl was half empty. "Because you fell off my barn roof, and I didn't want to spend the rest of the week explaining a body to the sheriff." Something shifted in his expression. "That's not the reason." She didn't answer. He finished the soup, set the bowl down carefully, his hands almost steady now. "The roof is patched," he said, "as well as I could manage with what you had. It should hold through the rest of the season." "Thank you." "Don't thank me." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have eaten something before I started. That was stupid of me." "Yes, it was," she paused. "You can't leave tonight. It's still too cold and you're too weak." He looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Elara." She said it before she decided to. "And I know what I'm saying. There's a spare room. My husband's. I moved to the smaller bedroom after he died. You can use it." He studied her face for a long moment, looking for angles, looking for something hidden. Whatever he was searching for, he must have decided it wasn't there. "Just tonight," he said. "Just tonight," she agreed. She showed him to the room. It was small and dark, smelling of dust and pipe tobacco and the ghost of a man she hadn't grieved as much as she probably should have. The bed was narrow, the blankets were thin. She told him about the chamber pot and left before the awkwardness of the situation could close around her. In her own room, she sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the sounds of him settling the creak of the old bed frame, the sound of boots dropped on the floor. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes. What was she doing? What on earth was she doing? But the answer, when she was honest with herself, was simple. She had seen a man at the edge of what he could endure, and she had recognized it immediately because she had been standing at that same edge for 3 months. She had seen the horse trembling in her barn, and she had known without words that some forms of suffering you simply do not turn away from. And if that made her a fool, she had been a fool before and survived it. Outside, the wind had gentled to something ordinary, a cold plains wind instead of the killing fury of last night's storm. Elara lay down in her clothes and pulled the blankets to her chin and listened to another person breathing in the next room, the first time in 3 months that sound had existed in this house. She was asleep before she had fully processed the fact of it. The smell of coffee woke her, real coffee. Not the chicory root she'd been using since October, which tasted like dirt and broken promises, but actual coffee, rich and dark and strong enough to be smelled through a closed door. Elara lay still for a moment in the gray morning light, certain she was dreaming. She got up. Declan was at her stove, a pot steaming over the rebuilt fire. He'd woken before her and coaxed last night's embers back to life, which should have annoyed her. It was her stove, her fire. But the coffee existed, and she found her capacity for annoyance significantly reduced. He turned when he heard her. He'd shaved at some point using water from the ewer on the washstand, and without the heavy beard, he looked younger and somehow more serious, more present. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing at the pot. "I had some in my saddlebag, thought we could both use it. I mind that you used my stove without asking." She moved toward the pot. "I'll forgive it this once." He poured her a cup, and she wrapped both hands around the warm tin and closed her eyes and breathed. When she took the first sip, it was strong enough to make her eyes water, and it was the best thing she had tasted in 4 months, and she had to look away to keep her expression from doing something embarrassing. "I'll be heading out after this," he said. He was leaning against the wall, cup in hand, watching her. Roads should be passable by now. "All right." She drank her coffee, said nothing. The room was very quiet. "Are you going to be all right for food, I mean?" "I'll manage." That's not an answer. She looked at him. He was watching her with a directness that should have felt presumptuous, and somehow didn't, maybe, because there was no judgment in it. Just the question, plain and unadorned. "I need to get to town," she said. "I have eggs to sell and credit to beg for and a banker to avoid. Once the roads are clear, it'll manage. I could take you." She started to refuse. The refusal was already fully formed, a wall she'd built and maintained and lived behind for 3 months. "I don't need help. I will handle it myself. I am not someone who takes things from people." But the roads were not clear yet, and she had 3 eggs to sell. And town was 6 miles, which was 2 hours in snow this deep on foot, on legs already tired and boots already falling apart. "Your horse is strong enough for 2, she asked. "He can handle it." A pause. "His name's Atlas. And before you ask, yes, I know it's a ridiculous name for a horse. He was very small when I got him." She looked at him. Something almost warm moved through her expression, there and gone. "Give me 10 minutes. The ride to Claremont took nearly 2 hours. Atlas moved through the snow with careful, powerful strides, and Elara sat in front of Declan on the saddle, hyper-aware of every shift in his weight behind her every breath. He took the warmth of him against her back. He kept his hands on the reins and his arms loose at his sides, not touching her unless the horse stumbled and he needed to steady them both. Careful, respectful, present without intruding. She watched the landscape pass, everything transformed by the snow into something almost beautiful, almost enough to make you forget how deadly it was. The plains stretched in every direction, white and enormous, and silent, broken occasionally by the dark lines of a fence or the dark shape of a homestead huddled against the cold. "Where are you from originally?" she asked, because the silence had grown comfortable enough to speak into. "Missouri," he said. "Little town called Caulfield. My father had a farm there." A pause. He died when I was 17. Farm accident." He said it the way people said things they had carried long enough that the weight had become ordinary. "My mother went to live with her sister in St. Louis. I started drifting." "How long ago was that?" 13 years, give or take. She tried to imagine 13 years of constant movement. No place to call home. No anchor anywhere. It sounded exhausting, but she could also uncomfortably understand the appeal. The appeal of not being attached to anything. Not being able to lose what you didn't have. "You never wanted to settle?" she asked. "Get your own land." "Wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. "Never seemed to work out. I'd save enough, find a spot that looked promising, and then something would go wrong. Bad weather, bad luck, bad decisions. After a while, I just stopped trying." She understood that too. Claremont appeared out of the white plains like a mirage, one main street, maybe 24 buildings, a population that swelled to 300 in summer and shrank to half that in winter. The general store, the saloon, the church, the bank, all of them huddled together in the cold like animals sharing warmth. Declan helped her dismount in front of the general store, his hand steady and impersonal at her waist. "How long do you need?" "An hour, maybe 2. I have business at the bank." "I'll be at the livery. Find me when you're done." He rode away, and Elara turned to face the store window where Mrs. Hargrove was already watching from behind the glass with the expression of a woman who had recently been deprived of interesting gossip and hoped this was the beginning of some. Elara squared her shoulders and went in. The negotiations were brief and humiliating. 6 cents for her 3 eggs, half what they were worth, and both women knew it. 6 cents worth of flour and beans and lard, which amounted to enough to last her perhaps 4 days if she was careful. Mrs. Hargrove offering credit for Robert's sake because Robert had been such a valued customer, which was a polite fiction for saying Robert had drunk his way through half the county's goodwill before dying and leaving her to sort out the wreckage. The bank was worse. Arthur Pemberton did not rise when she entered his office. He had the careful neutrality of a man who dealt in other people's misfortunes professionally and had learned to keep his satisfaction off his face. He was willing to give her until spring thaw, he said. Perhaps 3 months, perhaps 4. After that, if she couldn't make a payment, he would foreclose. He was not a heartless man, he added. She could always remarry. Young women her age often found it was the most practical solution. Remarry. Sell herself again was what he meant. Find another man to work for in exchange for shelter and security. Another arrangement built on transaction and practicality dressed up in the language of partnership. She thanked him she had learned to thank men like Arthur Pemberton because anger cost more than you could afford, and walked out into the cold. Declan was waiting outside the livery with Atlas. He saw her face before she could arrange it, and whatever he saw there made him straighten. "You all right? Just the ghost of my future," she said. Then, because she was tired and hungry, and the bank conversation had used up the last of her composure, "I'm fine, I'm always fine. It's practically my defining characteristic." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Have you eaten today, since the coffee this morning?" "I'm fine." That's still not an answer. He took her elbow gently, but with a firmness that surprised her and steered her toward the saloon. "Come on, you can argue with me after you've eaten something." She did argue. She argued all the way across the street and through the door of the saloon and into the corner table he found, and then the food arrived, real beef stew thick with vegetables and potatoes with fresh bread still warm from the oven, and the argument simply stopped because she was too busy trying to eat slowly and with dignity when her body wanted to do the opposite. Across from her, Declan ate in silence and did not comment on the tears she was carefully not shedding. "Thank you," she said finally when the bowl was empty and she had recovered enough to be civil. "You're welcome." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" "You can try." "What would you do if things were different? If the farm was secure and the money wasn't an issue? What would you actually want to do?" She looked at him. Nobody had asked her that, and she couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her that. Robert had asked her once early on and hadn't really listened to her answer. "I'd teach," she said. "There's no school in Claremont. The children here grow up without education because their parents can't afford to send them anywhere. And by the time they're old enough to leave, the world has already decided what they're worth. I'd build a school. Nothing fancy, just a one-room building where children could learn to read and add and know something about the world outside this county." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not pity, not that hollow performance of interest that people used when they were waiting for you to finish talking. Actual attention. "You'd be good at it," he said. "You're patient and clear, and you care about things." "How would you know that?" "Because you gave a stranger soup and a bed in the middle of a blizzard when you had almost nothing. People who don't care about things don't do that." She looked away. "That was pragmatism. A dead man in my barn would have been a problem." "It was kindness," he said with the quiet certainty of someone who had been on the receiving end of it and knew the difference. "You can call it whatever you want." They rode home through the late afternoon light, the sun painting the snow gold and pink, and Elara allowed herself to lean slightly into the warmth at her back and didn't make herself stop. When they reached the homestead, she stood in the fading light and looked at it. Shabby, yes. Leaning fences and a barn that needed more than one day's worth of patching and a cabin with drafts in every wall. But still standing, still hers, still possible maybe if she could hold on long enough. "You should stay another night," she said. "It'll be below zero tonight. You'll freeze." "Mrs. Whitfield." "Elara." She met his eyes. "I know you don't owe me anything. I know we're strangers. But it's one night and I could—" She stopped, swallowed, made herself say the honest thing instead of the proud one. "I could use the company. That's all." He studied her face for a long moment. "All right," he said. "One more night." She nodded, turned back toward the cabin before he could see what was on her face. That evening they sat at the table and ate the thin soup that was all she had, and she asked him about his travels, and he asked her about her life before Robert, and somewhere in the middle of it, she realized she had been talking for an hour without once calculating the cost of every word. "I could stay," he said, when the fire had burned low and the night had settled around the cabin. A few days, help with repairs before I move on. She should say no. A few days, she heard herself say. That's all. That's all, he agreed. Outside, the wind rose and fell like breathing. Inside the small cabin, something was quietly beginning. Something that neither of them named that night because naming it too soon would have frightened them both. But it was beginning. Part 2, the weight of what remains. The few days stretched into a week before either of them mentioned it. It happened by increments, the way most significant things happen, not all at once, but in small accumulations that each seemed reasonable on their own. One day, Declan fixed the barn door that had been hanging crooked since November. The next day, he repaired a gap in the cabin's east wall where the wind came through with such persistence that Elara had simply started sleeping on the opposite side of the room. The day after that, he found the fence post that had heaved out of the frozen ground on the south pasture and reset it working in cold that would have turned most men back to their fires. Elara watched. She tried not to watch, but the windows of the cabin faced the yard, and her work was inside the cabin, and her eyes kept finding him. He worked with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime doing hard things with whatever was available. No wasted motion, no complaint. He approached each broken thing with the same methodical attention, assessing, deciding, executing, and when he'd finished, he moved to the next without ceremony. She found herself thinking more than once that this was what competence looked like when it had nothing to prove. On the 5th day, she brought him coffee at mid-morning instead of waiting for him to come inside for the noon meal. It was a small thing. She told herself it was simply practical. He was working hard, and she had coffee, and that telling herself felt adequate for about 30 seconds before she gave up on it. He was working on the chicken coop, replacing boards that had gone rotten through the fall. He turned when he heard her footsteps in the snow, and his expression did something brief and surprised when he saw the cup in her hand quickly covered by something more neutral. "Thank you," he said, taking it. "You're fixing my coop. Your chickens are cold. They're chickens. They're your food supply for the winter." He drank. "Also, they seem to have opinions about me. The big one keeps staring." Elara looked at the bird in question, a Rhode Island red with a fixed, assessing gaze. "That's Margaret. She stares at everyone. She's judging me." "She probably is." Elara looked at him. "She has good instincts." He met her eyes over the rim of the cup. Something passed between them, not quite an understanding, not quite a question, but something in between that neither of them knew yet how to name. "I'll be done with this today," he said. "I want to look at the root cellar tomorrow. The latch is rusted through. You said a few days. It's only been 5. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The root cellar," she said, "does need fixing." She took the empty cup and went back to the cabin. Soon, in the evenings, they ate whatever Elara could stretch from her depleted pantry. This was at first the most difficult thing. Not his presence in the barn, not his presence in the house, not even the quiet domesticity of sharing the small space. The difficult thing was the food, or rather, the lack of it. She was ashamed of what she put in front of him. Thin soups, flat bread made with too much water and too little flour, beans boiled so long they'd gone soft and flavorless. He never said a word about it. He ate what she gave him and said thank you, and that was the end of it. On the 8th day he came in from town, she'd given him leave to ride Atlas to Claremont for supplies. They'd agreed were necessary, not because she trusted him entirely, but because she needed lumber and couldn't carry it herself. And he came back with a sack of oats and a half-pound of salt pork that he set on the table without comment. She stood very still for a moment looking at the food. "That's from your wages," she said, "from your savings." "I had some money." He hung up his coat. "We needed food. It's not complicated. You don't owe me provisions." "Elara." He said her name quietly without any particular emphasis, but it stopped her. "I ate your soup for 8 days. The very least I can do is bring back something worth cooking. It's not charity, it's math." She looked at the salt pork. She looked at the oats. She thought about what a real meal would taste like, what it had been like to eat something that didn't have the slight taste of desperation. "Thank you," she said, and made herself stop there and not add anything that would undercut it. He nodded and went to tend to Atlas, and Elara cooked the best dinner she'd made in months, and they ate it together at the table in the firelight and spoke about ordinary things, the state of the roads, the prospects for spring planting, whether the weather would break before March. She noticed that evening that the silence between sentences had changed quality. It was no longer the wary silence of two strangers assessing each other for threat. It had become something else, the comfortable quiet of people who had simply run out of need to fill every moment with words. She didn't know when that had happened. She wasn't sure she wanted to examine it too closely. Where are you from? Declan asked one evening, 3 weeks into what they had stopped calling a few days. They were sitting at the table after dinner, the fire burning steady, the wind outside doing its plains thing of rising and falling with no particular agenda. He'd produced a worn deck of cards from somewhere and taught her a game called pitch that she suspected he'd made up at least half the rules for. Iowa, she said, laying down a card. Little town called Pemberton's Crossing. My father had a feed store. Had typhoid. She said it the way she'd learned to say it flat and direct and moving on quickly because lingering on it had never helped anyone. Swept through in the spring when I was 18, took my parents and both my brothers in 3 weeks. I was the only one left. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Robert was in town on business. He offered to take me back to Colorado, marry me. She picked up a card, put it down. I said yes, because the alternative was considerably worse. Did you love him? The question surprised her, not because it was out of line, but because almost no one ever asked it. The people who knew her situation either already knew the answer or were too polite to inquire. No, she said. I respected him at first, thought maybe it would grow into something more. She paused. He wasn't cruel. I want to be accurate about that. He never raised a hand to me, but there are other ways to make someone feel like they don't exist. Declan set his cards face down on the table and looked at her. That's no way to live, he said. It was the only way I had. She met his eyes. What about you? There wasn't anyone in 13 years. There was a woman in Kansas 4 years ago, Sarah. He said the name carefully like it was a thing he'd carried long enough that the weight had become familiar. She was kind and funny, and she deserved more than a man who didn't know how to stay anywhere. I left before I could disappoint her. Did she know you were going? I told her I was taking work in New Mexico. She knew what that meant. That's a coward's way out. He blinked, then slowly a small smile. Yes, he said. It was. She hadn't expected him to agree that easily. Most men would argue. Most men are wrong about most things. He picked up his cards. I've had 4 years to think about it. Sarah deserves someone who would stay, and I couldn't be that person yet. I could have told her directly instead of dressing it up as employment opportunity. I know that. He paused. Your turn. She played a card. They were quiet for a moment. Yet, she said. He looked at her. You said you couldn't be that person yet. She kept her eyes on her cards, implying that you might be now, or that you're trying to be. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind lifted and fell. I'm trying, he said simply. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I'm trying. Yeah. 3 weeks in, and Elara began to understand what it felt like to have a partner. Not a husband. She wasn't ready to use that word even in her own mind. And Declan wasn't asking for it, but a partner in the simple, practical sense. Someone to split the weight with. Someone who checked the barn in the morning while she started the fire. Someone who noticed when her bootlace had split and brought back a new one from town without being asked who moved the heavy water barrel to a more accessible spot because he'd noticed her struggling with it, who listened when she talked without calculating whether her next words would be useful to him. She hadn't known how much she'd missed that. Having someone who listened. Robert had not been a listener. Robert had been a man who went through the world expecting it to accommodate him and was briefly professionally civil when it didn't. 3 years of marriage had trained Elara to ration her words, to weigh each one for likely usefulness before speaking, to expect that anything she said would be received with a kind of distant neutrality that was somehow lonelier than silence. Declan asked questions, he followed up. He said things like, what do you mean by that? And tell me more about that, and actually waited for the answer. It was disorienting. She kept checking for the angle, the thing he wanted from her, that this behavior was designed to extract. She found nothing. There didn't seem to be an angle. He appeared to simply be interested in what she thought. You're doing it again, he said one morning when she caught herself watching him from the window. She hadn't heard the cabin door open. She spun around. He was standing in the doorway with snow on his shoulders, an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. Doing what? She said very calmly. Trying to figure out what I want from you. He stepped inside and stamped the snow from his boots. You get this look, very analytical. I'm not. You are. It's all right. He hung up his coat. I'd be doing the same in your position. She folded her arms. And what's your assessment of your own motives? He considered this seriously, which was something she'd noticed about him. He took questions seriously, even ones asked in self-defense. I want to be useful, he said. I want to do work that matters. He paused. I want to stay. The word landed in the room and neither of them moved. You said a few days, she said. I know what I said. She turned back to the stove because she needed somewhere to put her face. The mortgage is due in April, she said to the pot she was stirring. The bank won't extend past spring thaw. When they foreclose, there'll be nothing left here to stay for. Then let me help you hold on to it until spring. With what you don't have the money to pay the bank, and neither do I. No, he said, but I have two hands and a strong back, and I know how to work land. And together, don't. She turned around. Don't say that word like it's a solution. You don't know this situation. You don't know how far in debt we are. I am. How far behind everything is. He met her eyes and did not look away. Then tell me, he said, all of it. Let me know what we're actually dealing with. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the angle, finding none. She sat down and told him it took an hour. The mortgage, how much was owed, how much was past due, what the bank had said, the livestock, Bessie's declining production, the chickens, the total value of her assets, the land which 40 acres was worth, which soil was good and which was played out, what Robert had neglected and what was salvageable. The seed, what she'd need for spring planting, what it would cost, what she couldn't afford. Declan listened to all of it. He asked questions, good questions, specific questions, questions that told her he understood farming and land and debt, that he wasn't hearing this from a position of comfortable ignorance. He made mental calculations she could see happening behind his eyes. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The wheat field on the east side, he said. You said Robert left it fallow last year. He couldn't afford the seed. If it's been sitting fallow for a year, the soil will be better for it. That's where we start. Plant it heavy with wheat, sell whatever we don't need for ourselves. With the labor split between us, we can manage 20 acres instead of 10. That's twice the yield. With what seed money? I have savings, not a lot, but enough to get us started. She stared at him. You're offering to put your money into my failing farm. Our plan, he said, if you'll let it be ours. Something in her chest did something complicated and difficult. Declan, you don't. I know I don't have to. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, eyes steady on hers. But I want to. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you know this could work. Not easily, not without risk, but it could work. She was quiet for a long time. The fire made its small sounds. The wind moved over the cabin. The bank needs a payment by April, she said finally. We can make it work. It's a lot to promise. I know. He didn't look away. I'm promising it anyway. February deepened and then began incrementally to loosen its grip. The days grew slightly longer, not warm, not even comfortable, but longer. The light persisting a few minutes further into the afternoon each day, which felt like a form of hope. They fell into a routine that was comfortable in a way that surprised Elara every time she noticed it. Declan had taken over the heavier outdoor work without discussion, not because she couldn't do it, but because he was larger, and the work was physically brutal in a way that left her drained, and he had noticed that and responded to it without comment. In exchange, she managed the house and the animals and the accounts, the careful calculations of seed and yield and debt that she kept in a notebook Robert had never known existed. It was partnership in the actual meaning of the word. She had not expected to know what that felt like. They talked more in those weeks than Elara had talked in 3 years of marriage. About everything, about nothing. She told him about the school she'd always wanted to build the children in Claremont who were growing up without education because there was no school and their parents had too much land to work and too little money to send them away. He listened to her describe it and asked what she'd teach them and what she'd need to get started, and the conversation got so specific and concrete that she ended up sketching out a rough curriculum in her notebook and then felt briefly foolish about it, and he told her not to be, that it was worth planning for. He told her about his father. Not the accident she understood instinctively, that the accident was a door he kept mostly closed, but the man himself. A farmer who spoke through work rather than words, whose love was expressed in the things he built and maintained and kept in good repair. He never said it, Declan said one evening looking at the fire. Not once that I can remember, but you always knew, because if something mattered to you, he'd fix it. Without being asked, without mentioning it. You'd come out in the morning and the thing that was broken would just be fixed. Elara thought about that. You do the same thing, she said. He looked at her. The bootlace, she said, the water barrel, the draft in the north wall. She met his eyes. You fix things. He was quiet for a moment. Learned it somewhere, he said finally. She nodded and looked back at the fire and didn't push further because she could tell the conversation had reached the edge of something he wasn't ready to step over. And she had learned to recognize edges. On the 15th of February, the storm came. It arrived without proper warning, or rather with the kind of warning that only makes sense in retrospect. The sky had been a particular shade of gray all day, not the ordinary gray of winter overcast, but something with a greenish undertone that Elara had seen once before 4 years ago, the day before the storm that had killed the Hendersons' cattle. She mentioned it at dinner but didn't push the point, and they went to bed under a sky that was quiet and getting quieter. She woke to the sound of the world trying to end. The wind hit the cabin at a different pitch than the February blizzard, higher and more sustained, like something with genuine purpose. The windows rattled in their frames. The fire in the stove that had been burning low went out entirely as the chimney draft reversed. Snow was forcing itself through the gaps around the door, the ones Declan had partially sealed but not finished. She heard him already moving in the next room. He appeared in her doorway. She'd left the door open, which she wouldn't have done a month ago, fully dressed, pulling on his coat. "The barn," he said. "I need to check the animals." "I'll come. You'll stay." He said it without force, without the particular male firmness that meant this conversation is over. He said it like a man explaining a practical reality. "You're smaller. The wind will knock you over before you make 10 feet. I'll go." She wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that these were her animal, her responsibility, that she'd been managing this homestead alone for 3 months. Instead, she looked at the window, white chaos, completely impenetrable, and said, "Be careful." He nodded and went out, and the door slammed behind him, and Elara was alone with the sound of the storm. She fed the fire. She paced the cabin. She counted to 60, repeatedly tracking time. 5 minutes, 10, 15. At 25 minutes, she was reaching for her coat when the door burst open and Declan stumbled in, snow-covered and breathing hard. He hadn't been gone long enough for frostbite, but his face was raw and red and his hands were shaking. "Animals are fine." He got out, leaning against the closed door. "Barn's holding. There's some damage to the... He stopped, coughing. "North wall, but nothing critical. I closed it off as best I could." Elara filled a cup with hot water from the kettle she'd kept on the stove and pressed it into his hands. Then, without deciding to, she took his hands in both of hers and began working warmth back into his fingers, rubbing them between her palms, feeling the resistance of cold in his joints, gradually give way to something more flexible. "Can you feel them?" she asked. "Starting to." His voice was quiet. "Thank you." "Stop saying thank you for things I'd do for anyone. You wouldn't do it for anyone." He said it simply, without challenge. "You do it for people who matter to you." She kept her eyes on his hands. "You fell off my barn roof last month. I have a vested interest in keeping you functional." "Is that all it is?" She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had been carefully not looking at for 2 weeks, not careful anymore. Open in a way that should have frightened her and somehow didn't. "Declan," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's fast. I know you've been through something that makes trust feel like a weapon people use against you. I'm not trying to rush anything. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything." He turned his hands over in hers carefully so that he was holding them instead of the other way around. "I just want you to know that what I feel, it's not temporary. It's not gratitude or convenience or cabin fever. It's the most certain thing I've felt in 13 years. She looked at their joined hands, at the firelight on his face. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I've never..." She stopped. Tried again. "Robert wasn't unkind exactly, but he didn't see me. Not really. And I got used to not being seen. I got good at it. And now you're..." She stopped again, frustrated with herself. "I see you," he said quietly. "I know that's not enough. I know it takes time. But I see you, Elara, and I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the storm screamed its fury. Inside the small cabin, the fire found enough wood and caught, and the warmth grew by degrees, and Elara did not let go of his hands. "Dim." She kissed him first. She hadn't planned it. It was 2 days after the storm, and they were standing in the barn assessing the damage to the north wall, discussing the repairs needed and the wood they'd require, and the sequence of work, and she looked at him mid-sentence, at his face in the barn light, at the particular way he focused when he was thinking through a problem, at the small scar along his jaw that she'd noticed the first morning when he'd shaved and had never stopped noticing, and she simply stopped talking and kissed him. He went very still for a heartbeat. She felt it, the brief, complete arrest of motion. Then his hand came up to her face, gentle and careful, and he kissed her back, and with the same thoroughness he applied to everything else. And it was nothing at all like anything she'd known with Robert, and the difference was so stark that she had to step back from it or be completely undone. She put her hand flat on his chest. He stopped immediately. "Too fast," he said. "No," she looked up at him. "Too much, too real. I need a moment." He nodded. He waited. He did not take the space she needed as rejection, which was something she had not known to hope for. "I've been waiting for the other shoe," she said. "For 3 weeks I've been looking for the thing that's wrong, the angle, the price." She met his eyes. "I can't find one." "There isn't one." "I know." She let out a breath. "That's the part I'm having trouble with." He brought her hand to his lips, the knuckles lightly, a gesture so old-fashioned it should have seemed absurd and somehow seemed exactly right. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "You keep saying that." "I keep meaning it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand and held it, and they stood in the barn in the cold winter light, and she let herself want this, really want it, without immediately cataloging all the reasons it couldn't work for the first time in longer than she could remember. The last days of February brought a thaw, brief and tentative, the sun appearing for whole hours at a stretch, the snow softening at its edges. The roads became passable. The world that had been reduced to the homestead and the distance to Claremont began to expand again, to include possibilities that winter had foreclosed. Declan took work at the Bergstrom Ranch 3 days a week. They were hiring hands for spring preparation, and the pay was $2 a day, plus meals, which added up to enough over 2 months to cover the April mortgage payment, with something left over. It was the first piece of concrete good news she'd had since October, and she spent an evening doing the math in her notebook. 4 different ways to make sure it was real. "You'll be gone 3 days a week," she said when he told her. "Come home every night," he said, "no matter how tired, I promised." "I didn't ask you to promise that." "No, but you need to hear it." He looked at her steadily. 3 days gone, 4 days here, and every night in between I come home." She looked at him. Something in her chest made a complicated movement. "All right," she said, "but if you die falling off someone else's barn roof, I'll do my best to avoid it." She hit him with the dish towel. He caught it, laughed a real laugh, the kind that involved his whole face, the kind she'd been accumulating observations of for weeks, and she felt the warmth spreading through her chest and gave up finally on trying to prevent it. This was real. It was inconvenient and complicated and built on circumstances that should have made it impossible, and it was real. The first Monday he rode out before dawn, she made herself not stand at the window and watch him go. She failed. She watched him all the way down the road until he disappeared into the early morning dark, and then she stood there for another minute, looking at the empty road, and then she turned and put the coffee on and reminded herself that he was coming back. He did come back. Every night, tired and smelling of horses and outdoor work, he came in and ate dinner and told her about his day and listened to her talk about hers. Every night without exception. She stopped waiting for him to nod. On a Sunday evening in early March, sitting by the fire with the cards between them and the wind moving over the cabin, like an old friend, Declan set his hand face down on the table and said, "Marry me." Elara looked at her cards. Then she looked at him. "That's not how you win at pitch," she said. "Elara." "Declan?" He was watching her with that steady, open expression. No angle, no performance, just the actual question lying there between them, like something fragile that needed handling carefully. "It's too fast," she said. "Probably. People will talk. Robert's been gone 6 months. People talk regardless. I stopped caring what people said about me somewhere around 1878. This is my life, my reputation. I know." He didn't flinch from it. "And I'm asking you to let me be part of it. Officially. Permanently." A pause. "Not because of the bank, although it would help. Because I love you, and I want to stand beside you when they call your name, and I want to build that school you're always sketching in your notebook, and I want to be here when the wheat comes up, and when the mortgage is paid, and when whatever comes next comes next." She looked at him. "You could wait," he said quietly. "I'll wait with you, but I want you to know what I want." The fire made its small sound. Outside, the wind was ordinary. Inside the cabin, Elara held the question for a long, careful moment, turning it over, looking for the catch. She found nothing but the man across the table, his dark eyes steady, his hands on the worn surface of the wood, waiting. "Ask me again," she said. He understood. He didn't repeat the words. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her and let the question live in his eyes instead of his voice. Yes, she said, and despite everything, despite all the ways the world had taught her that hope was a thing that got taken from you, she meant it entirely. Well, the days that immediately followed the engagement were strange in a way Elara hadn't anticipated. Not bad strange, the opposite, which was almost harder to manage. She had spent so long braced for the worst that the absence of it left her slightly off balance, like a woman who has been leaning into a headwind so long that when it stops, she stumbles forward. Declan did not change after she said yes. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not become more presumptuous or less careful. He did not relax the particular quality of his attention that she had come to rely on. He woke before dawn and made coffee and was already out working when she rose, and he came in at noon for the meal they shared, and in the evenings they sat together, and the evenings were exactly as they had been, except that there was now this word between them. Yes, that changed the nature of the light in the room without changing any of its actual components. She mentioned this to Clara Austin when Clara came to visit in the third week of March, bringing a jar of pickled beets she'd put up in the fall, and the particular kind of energy that meant she'd been saving up things to say. He's the same, Elara said. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the coffee between them, the sound of Declan hammering somewhere outside. I expected something to change, something to shift, but he's exactly the same. Is that a complaint? Clara asked in the tone of someone who already knew the answer. No, Elara considered. I don't know what the word is. Robert changed after we married. He didn't change much or in obvious ways, but there was something that dropped some quality of attention. Like once the arrangement was secure, he didn't need to keep trying. Clara nodded slowly. Declan doesn't have that, Elara said. The performing, the version of himself he put on when something needed to be obtained. There isn't a performance. What I see now is what I saw at the beginning. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. You could try believing it, Clara said. I'm working on it. How's that going? Elara looked at the table. Slowly, she said. Better. Clara drank her coffee and didn't push further, which was one of the reasons she was good company. She understood that some things moved at the speed they moved and that acceleration was not always help. Outside, the hammering continued its steady, purposeful rhythm. Elara had stopped having to actively remind herself what it meant. It was becoming something she simply knew. The way you know what weather is coming from the color of the evening sky, he was there. He was working, and when the work was done, he would come inside. This was her life. This was the shape of her life now. She was still learning to fit inside it without flinching. The week before the wedding, she cleaned the cabin from floor to ceiling, not because it was dirty, but because she needed somewhere to put all the energy that the wedding was generating in her body. She scrubbed and polished and rearranged and rescrubbed and was on her hands and knees addressing a section of floor that had arguably never needed this much attention when Declan found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The floor is clean, he said. It's not clean enough. Elara, I'm nervous, she said, still scrubbing. Let me scrub the floor. He sat down on the nearest chair and watched her for a moment. What are you nervous about? He asked in the tone of someone asking a practical question. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Everything working out, she said. That's what I'm nervous about. I know how to be braced for things going wrong. I have a great deal of practice. The possibility of things actually continuing to go right, that's the thing I can't quite... She stopped, looked at the scrub brush in her hand. That's new territory. Yeah, he said, it is. You're nervous too. She hadn't expected that. I'm terrified, he said conversationally. I've been running for 13 years. Staying still is the scariest thing I've ever tried to do. She looked at him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching her with the easy directness she'd been learning to trust, and he looked, she thought, like a man who was telling the exact truth. But you're still here, she said. Still here, he agreed. She turned back to the floor. The scrubbing had become unnecessary, and they both knew it. She kept going anyway for a few more minutes, and then she set the brush down and got up and washed her hands and went to find something else to do, and the nervousness settled into something quieter, more like anticipation. On the morning of the wedding, Declan knocked on her bedroom door to tell her he'd brought hot water for the wash basin, and she said thank you through the door, and then she stood in the cold room dressing in her best dress and thought, this is happening. This is actually happening. She had told herself the same thing 6 years ago before her first marriage, and it had filled her with a dread she'd been too young and too desperate to name. She told herself it now and felt something entirely different. Not absence of fear, Fear was present, the kind of fear that lives alongside possibility, but underneath the fear, something solid, a foundation. She had chosen this. She had done so clearly with full information, without coercion or desperation, or the particular quiet terror of a 19-year-old with nowhere else to go. She had said yes, knowing exactly what she was saying, to a man she had watched carefully and found honest in circumstances she understood. That made all the difference. Yeah. The weeks between the wedding and the planting were a kind of threshold time. Not yet the real work of the season, not still winter, but something in between. They used it to prepare. Declan rode to the agricultural supply office in Claremont and came back with seed catalogs and cost estimates and a list of what they could afford and in what order. Elara worked through the accounts, a notebook she'd kept since November, tracking every cent that had come in and gone out, and together they made the plan for the year. It was the most pleasant kind of argument she had ever had. He wanted to plant more corn than she thought the irrigation could support. She thought they should put more of the east acreage into wheat, which was more reliable. They went back and forth on it over several evenings, each of them bringing their reasoning to the table like something worth examining, neither of them simply overriding the other. In the end, they split the difference, more wheat than corn, but more corn than she'd originally wanted, and when the season bore out their projections, it turned out she had been right about the wheat and he had been right about the corn, and they were both sufficiently pleased with their respective correctness to decline to argue the point. One evening in the middle of March, Declan came in from checking the animals with a particular expression, the one that meant he was carrying something he wasn't sure how to say. "What?" she asked without looking up from her accounts. "There's a family," he said, sitting down across from her. "New arrivals. Came through last week heading for the Northern Territory. Their wagon broke an axle on the Claremont Road, and they've been sheltering at the livery while the wheel gets fixed." She looked up. "Wife and 3 children," he said. "The husband got sick during the winter crossing. Died 2 weeks ago in a place called Mill Creek. She's been managing alone since then." "How old are the children?" "Oldest is maybe 12. The youngest is still nursing." Elara set down her pencil. She thought about November. She thought about what it meant to be alone in winter with a failing situation and no clear way forward. She thought about the pitchfork in her hands, which had been all she'd had between herself and despair. "Can they last another week?" she said, "while the wheel is fixed?" "I think so. The livery owner is decent, but after that they don't have the resources to continue north." "Do they know how to farm?" "She grew up on a farm in Ohio, from what I understand." Elara thought for a moment. She thought about the southeast corner of the property, the land Robert had never properly worked, that she and Declan had cleared of rocks and debris last fall, and hadn't planted yet because they couldn't manage all of it on their own. "We don't need the southeast corner this season," she said. He looked at her. "It's good land," she said. "Better than anything else on the property now that we've cleared it. If someone were to work it on shares, half the yield to them, half to us, it would more than pay for whatever trouble it caused." "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's practical," she said, and didn't entirely mean it, and knew he could tell. He smiled. "I'll ride out tomorrow and talk to them." The Danner family, Margaret and her children, whose names were Jacob Elise and baby William, moved on to the southeast corner in early April. They had almost nothing, a wagon with a repaired axle, a few tools, a particular determination of people who have survived things and intend to keep surviving. Margaret Danner was 32 years old and looked 40, but her eyes were sharp and her handshake was firm, and when she looked at the southeast corner, she didn't see what was missing from it. She saw what was possible. Elara recognized that way of looking. She had been learning it herself all year. The Danners built a temporary structure, a soddy that Jacob and Declan raised together in 2 weekends, and planted their share of the southeast field and became gradually a presence on the edge of the homestead. Margaret's children came to the school. Margaret herself came to share meals occasionally, which led to an exchange of skills. Margaret knew more about canning than Elara did, which was something Elara intended to remedy by the end of summer. "You took in a stranger during a blizzard," Clara observed when Elara mentioned the Danners. "And now you've given another stranger a corner of your farm. Is there a pattern forming?" "It's practical," Elara said. "You keep saying that word and expecting me to believe it." Elara looked at her. "Someone helped me when I had nothing," she said. "It seems reasonable to do the same when I can." "It's more than reasonable." Clara covered her hand briefly. "It's how things get better. Not all at once. Just one person at a time doing the same thing for the next one." Part 3. What takes root? They went to town on a Sunday because Sunday was when everyone gathered. Elara had chosen the timing deliberately, though she wouldn't have said so aloud. The courage required to face the town's judgment was a finite resource, and she preferred to spend it only once one announcement, one public moment, not a slow drip of whispered conversations and knowing looks. If people were going to talk, they could talk together, and she could look them in the eye while they did it. She wore her best dress, the one she'd worn to Robert's funeral, which was a coincidence she chose not to dwell on. Declan had brought wildflowers from somewhere, the first brave ones pushing up through the last of the snow, pale and small and stubborn. He handed them to her without commentary, and she held them and said nothing and was more moved by them than any expensive gesture could have made her. The congregation was spilling out of the church when they arrived bundled in Sunday clothes, trading the week's news and voices that carried on the still morning air. Heads turned as Atlas walked up the main street. Elara kept her back straight. Reverend Alderman approached them first, which she was grateful for. He was a kind man, practical and uncomplicated in his goodness, the sort of minister who understood that faith was practiced in kitchens and fields as much as in pews. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Marsh," he said, smiling at them both with the open warmth of someone genuinely glad to see people. "How are you faring out on the property? I heard the February storm was hard on the eastern county." "We managed," Elara said. Then, before she could give herself time to hesitate, "Reverend Mr. Marsh and I are engaged to be married. We'd like you to perform the ceremony." The silence that followed was brief and thorough. She heard Mrs. Hargrove's intake of breath from somewhere behind her. She did not look in that direction. Reverend Alderman looked at her face and then at Declan's and then at their joined hands. She hadn't realized until just then that she was holding his, and his smile, if anything, widened. "I think that's wonderful news," he said. "I'd be honored." "She's been widowed 6 months," Mrs. Hargrove said loudly enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. 6 months. It's indecent. "It's her life," said a voice from the back of the crowd, and Elara turned to see Clara Austin, whose husband had died 3 years ago and who understood better than most what it meant to survive it, standing with her arms folded and her chin up. And frankly, Marie, the fact that she found someone worth keeping is more than most of us can say. A ripple of something moved through the crowd, not agreement exactly, but a recalibration. Elara felt the pressure of the moment shift slightly in their favor. The banker, Arthur Pemberton, was standing at the edge of the gathering. He caught her eye and she caught his, and she held the look long enough that he was the one who looked away first. "Next Sunday," Reverend Alderman was saying to Declan. "That gives time for everything to be in proper order. I'll read the banns this morning." "Next Sunday," Declan agreed. He pressed her hand briefly and she felt the steadiness in it, the deliberate calm, and was grateful for it more than she could say. They went to the bank after, while the congregation was still finding new things to discuss. Arthur Pemberton was behind his desk. Of course he was. Arthur Pemberton lived behind his desk, and he looked up with the expression of a man who has been preparing for a difficult conversation. Declan set $40 on the desk. "Partial payment on the Whitfield mortgage," he said. "We'll have the balance by the end of April. The spring planting is already in the ground." Pemberton picked up the money, counted it, set it down. "This covers 2 months. You'll still owe for the balance." "We know what we owe," Elara said. "We're telling you we'll pay it." He looked at them both, at her set face and at Declan's quiet, steady expression. She could see him calculating, running the numbers of what he stood to gain against what he stood to lose if they actually delivered. "I'll note it in the ledger," he said finally. "The next payment is due in June. If you miss it—" "We won't," Declan said. They walked out into the sunshine, hand in hand. "He didn't believe us," Elara said. "No," a pause. "Let's make him wrong." She looked up at him. Something that might have been a laugh and might have been something closer to tears made its way through her chest. "Let's," she agreed. They married the following Sunday exactly as planned. The ceremony was small. Clara Austin and her husband as witnesses, along with 2 other families who had not been counted among the town's gossips, and proved it by showing up. Mrs. Hargrove was there as well, occupying the back pew with the particular expression of someone who objects to everything and cannot bring themselves to miss any of it. Reverend Alderman kept the ceremony brief and honest, which was all either of them had wanted. When Declan took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and direct, looking at her face and not at the words printed in the Reverend's book, because he'd learned them by heart in the week before. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't known to hope for it. She filed it away with the wild flowers and the bootlace and the rebuilt water barrel and all the other small accumulating evidences of the particular way this man showed the things he felt. When she spoke her own vows, her voice shook slightly at the start and steadied by the third word. She made herself hold his eyes through all of it. She had spent enough of her life looking away from things. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Declan kissed her carefully, chastely aware of the audience. And when they pulled apart, she saw in his face the exact same combination of joy and terror and fierce determination that she felt in her own chest. And it was the most honest mirror she'd ever been given. They signed the marriage certificate. They shook hands with the small, good crowd. They accepted Clara Austin's warm embrace and her husband's firm congratulations, and they walked out of the church as Mr. and Mrs. Marsh into a Sunday that was trying its best to be spring. The ride home was quiet. The sun was visible for the first time in days, pale and tentative, but real, laying long shadows across the snow. Elara leaned into Declan's warmth at her back and let herself simply be in it, in the moment, in the day, in the strange and improbable fact of being married to someone she had actually chosen. "You're thinking very hard about something," he said above her ear. "I'm thinking about all the ways this could still go wrong." A pause. And I've decided to stop thinking about it." She felt him shift behind her, something that might have been surprise or might have been relief. "That's the bravest thing you've said to me. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation for pragmatism." He laughed, and the sound of it settled around her shoulders like warmth. And spring arrived the way it always did on the high plains. Not gradually, not kindly, but all at once, as if the season had been waiting impatiently just past the horizon and finally got permission to proceed. One week the world was still locked in white and iron cold. The next the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the air smelled improbably of mud and growing things. They planted in early April. The east field, the one that had lain fallow through Robert's last year, the soil rested and better for it went in first with winter wheat. Declan had been right about it. She could feel the difference in the earth as she worked at a richness and receptivity that the overtaxed Westfield had lost. They planted together, the two of them moving down the rows in a rhythm that had developed over weeks of working side by side, and by the third day she had stopped noticing how sore her hands were. "You're better at straight rows than I am," he said, examining her work with something that might have been competitive respect. "I'm better at many things than you. Name three." "Accounting, patience." She considered. "Cards. I let you win at cards." "You absolutely do not." She pointed her planting stick at him. "You have a tell when you're bluffing. Your left ear moves." He put his hand to his left ear, startled. "It does not." "It does. I've been exploiting it for a month." He stared at her for a moment, then laughed that whole face laugh she'd been collecting without meaning to, and turned back to his row, and she filed the moment away with all the others. The corn went in on the south 40 close to the irrigation channel. The kitchen garden went in last, Elara's territory. The small plot Declan had assigned to her that first week with such casual generosity that she hadn't understood until later how much it had meant. She planted herbs first, the medicinal ones she'd always wanted, lavender and chamomile, and the kind of mint that would spread like a rumor if she let it, and then vegetables, and then in the corner nearest the cabin flowers. She had not planted flowers since her mother's garden in Iowa. She'd forgotten in the years of survival what it felt like to plant something purely for beauty. She planted marigolds and cosmos and black-eyed Susans and stood back when she was done and felt something release in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. Declan found her standing over the freshly turned soil that evening and stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. "Flowers," he said. "Flowers. Practical. Not in the least." She looked at the bare earth, imagining what it would look like in 6 weeks. "I needed something that was just for me." He nodded, said nothing else. She felt him understand it and was grateful again for the particular quality of his understanding, that it didn't require her to explain, didn't ask for justification, simply received the thing she'd offered and made room for it. She started teaching that spring. It began with Clara Austin's children, who were 7 and 9 and had been getting their education from a combination of their mother's memory of school and whatever books Clara could borrow. They came on Monday and Wednesday mornings, and Elara set up a space in the barn where the light was good, and she found the work so immediately right, so exactly what she'd imagined that she had, to stop herself from showing too much of what she was feeling, because the Austin children were already watching her with the particular alertness of children who sense they have found something worth paying attention to. Word spread the way things spread in small communities. By May, she had 5 students. By June, 9. The space in the barn was getting crowded, but she hadn't figured out yet how to solve that problem. And in the meantime, she rearranged the furniture and made do. The school needs its own building, Declan said one evening in June when she'd come in from a lesson still carrying the particular glow she always had afterward. That's years away. What if it wasn't? She looked at him. The back corner of the property, he said. I've been looking at it. There's good flat ground there wood from the timber we cleared last fall. I could build something basic, one room, good windows for light, a stove for winter. Nothing grand, but enough. She stared at him. That's Declan, that's months of work on top of everything else. Long evenings and short winters, he met her eyes. I want to. Let me. She looked at him for a moment. You keep making me speechless, she said. I'm not used to that. You'll adapt. A slight smile. Say yes. She said yes. 10. The June mortgage payment was made in full with the sale of the first early vegetables and Declan's wages from the Bergstrom ranch. She watched Pemberton write the notation in his ledger and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since October. On schedule, Declan said, steering her out of the bank before she could say something undiplomatic to the banker. He looked disappointed. Thoroughly, he held the door. Let's go ruin the rest of his week by being visibly happy. She was visibly happy. It turned out to be something she was capable of given the right conditions. July was hot and busy and the best month she could remember in years. The wheat was coming in beautifully. Declan checked it daily with the attentiveness of a man watching for something he'd wagered heavily on, which was accurate. The corn was strong. The kitchen garden was so productive that she'd begun putting up preserves with vegetables she could barely keep up with, lining them in the root cellar with a satisfaction that was close to pride. The schoolhouse frame went up in July, Declan working evenings and Saturdays occasionally with help from James Austin and one of the Bergstrom boys who came out on weekends. It was simple framing, nothing fancy, but it was straight and solid, and by the end of the month, it had a roof. She brought lunch to the worksite every day. She didn't frame it as helping him. She framed it as bringing food to the people who were working on her school, but she watched the structure go up board by board and felt something building inside her chest in the same rhythm. One afternoon, she stood in the partially finished schoolhouse walls, up, roof on floor, still bare, dirt, windows, still empty frames, and turned in a slow circle and tried to see it as it would be. Benches, a blackboard, children, morning light through those south-facing windows. She heard Declan's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. What are you seeing? He asked. Everything, she said. All at once, it's... She stopped, shook her head. I don't have the words for it. You don't need the words. He came to stand beside her. I can see it on your face. She turned to look at him. He was dusty from the work and tired in the good way, the way of someone whose body had been well used for something that mattered. Thank you, she said. Not for the building, for, she gestured vaguely at all of it, at everything. He understood. He always understood. Thank you for letting me, he said simply. She kissed him in the half-built schoolhouse on a July afternoon, and it tasted like sawdust and summer heat, and something she had not had a name for until recently. The wheat harvest came in late August, and it was better than she dared to plan for. They hired 2-day laborers from town men who worked for wages and a portion of the crop, and the 4 of them spent a week cutting and bundling under a sun that was generous to the point of cruelty, coming home every evening, too tired to do more than eat and sleep. Elara worked alongside the men, ignoring the raised eyebrows, tying bundles until her hands blistered, and then kept going. When it was done and they'd hauled the wheat to the mill, and Declan had come back from town with the payment in his hand, he sat down at the kitchen table and pushed the cash toward her without speaking. She counted it again, did the math against what they owed. We're going to make it, she said. He nodded. He'd known it for a week, but he'd waited for her to see the numbers herself. The fall payment, she said, and there's enough left for seed and for the schoolhouse windows, and... She stopped. Declan, we're going to make it, he agreed. She put the money in the tin box she kept at the back of the pantry and then sat back down at the table and folded her hands on the surface and breathed. I keep waiting to believe it, she said. Give it time. It's real, isn't it? This is real. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. It's real, he said. Every acre of it. She looked at his hands over hers. She thought about the woman she had been in November alone in this cabin, calculating how many days she had left before it all fell apart, sitting with that cold stone weight of certainty in her chest. She thought about the storm and the bang of the barn door and the shadow in the back corner and the pitchfork in her hands. I almost didn't let you stay, she said. I know. I almost made you leave. I know. He squeezed her hands gently. What stopped you? She thought about it. The horse, she said. Atlas, he was trembling. And I couldn't send him away in that storm. Then we both owe Atlas. She laughed, and the sound of it surprised her how easy it came now, how unguarded. She had forgotten she could laugh like that. Robert had not been a man who made things feel safe enough for laughter, and she had filed that part of herself away without fully knowing she'd done it. Declan had found it somehow, the way you find things you've put somewhere safe and then forgotten gradually and then all at once. Men. In September, she found out she was pregnant. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told him, not out of fear exactly, but out of the habit of carrying things alone before she remembered she had someone to carry them with. On the third evening after dinner, she set down her fork and looked at him across the table. I need to tell you something. He looked up, his expression immediately careful. I think we're going to need to add a room to the cabin, she said. Before February, he stared at her. Then he worked out the math. Elara. Yes. He was around the table before she'd finished the word, pulling her out of her chair, his arms around her with a thoroughness that lifted her feet briefly off the floor. She felt him trembling, actually trembling, this large, steady man who was afraid of almost nothing, and pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held. We're all right, she said. Both of us. I'm healthy. The doctor in town says everything is as it should be. You went to the doctor without me. I needed to know first. He pulled back to look at her face. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, not the careful brightness of a man controlling his reactions, but the unguarded brightness of someone completely undone. I would have come with you. I know. She touched his jaw. Next time. He kissed her. Then he stood there holding her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression so open and full that she felt for the first time in her life genuinely and completely seen. A family, he said. We're going to have a family. We already are one, she said. Well, I'll just tell you, the fall mortgage payment was made in October, the first fully on-time, fully complete payment she'd made since Robert's death, and she set the receipt in the tin box with the others and felt something large and heavy lift away from her shoulders. Pemberton had not looked pleased. She had not tried to conceal her satisfaction at his displeasure. November brought the cold again, and the long evenings and the quiet domestic rhythms. She'd come to love the fire, the meals, the cards, the conversations that started in one place and ended somewhere she hadn't expected. She was reading to Declan from the novel she'd borrowed from Clara, and he was mending harness. And the fire was doing what fires do, and she thought, this is what I couldn't imagine. Not the farm succeeding, not the school being built, not any of the concrete things. This, the ordinary evening, the warmth, the not being alone. She stopped reading. What? He said. I'm happy, she said, as if reporting a meteorological fact. He set down the harness and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. I know, he said. I've been watching it happen for months. You went from, he paused, looking for the right word. From surviving. You went from surviving to living. Do you know the day I could tell? Tell me. The flowers, he said, the day you planted the flowers. That was the day I knew. She looked at him. The flowers were practical, she said. No, they weren't. They're good for the bees. Elara, she smiled slow and deliberate and unguarded, the kind of smile she'd only recently learned to stop preventing. No, she agreed, they weren't. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the firelight, while the wind moved over the cabin with familiar, ordinary purpose. And outside, the land that had nearly broken her was resting under its blanket of early snow, gathering itself for the spring they were already planning. The school opened in January, just before the baby came. She had not intended the timing. It was the windows that had delayed the opening, a supply problem that pushed everything back by 6 weeks, but it turned out to be right in its own way. She taught for 3 weeks in the new building with its 4 good windows and its wood stove and its rough-hewn benches with 9 children who arrived each morning carrying the particular alertness of people who have been waiting for something. And then in the last week of January, she handed the class to Clara Austin for a few days and went home and had her daughter. The birth was harder than she'd expected and easier than she'd feared, which she thought afterwards was a reasonable description of most significant things. Declan was there, she had insisted, over Doc Morrison's mild suggestion that perhaps the waiting room would be more appropriate, and she held his hand throughout with a grip that left marks, and he didn't mention the marks. When it was over and the baby was placed in her arms, she looked down at a face that was brand new and ancient, at the same time the way all new faces are, and felt the particular shock of love that has no preparation. The baby had Declan's dark eyes and her own stubborn jaw. "A girl," the doctor said as if she couldn't see. "A girl," Declan repeated. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at his daughter with the expression of a man whose world has just expanded by several dimensions. What should we call her? Elara had thought about this on and off for months. She had a list. She looked at her daughter's face and the list dissolved. "Clara," she said, "after the first person who stood up for us." Declan looked at her. Then he looked at the baby. "Clara Marsh," he said, testing it. Then, "Hello, Clara." The baby blinked at him with the solemn attention of someone who has just arrived somewhere very strange and is withholding judgment until she has more information. "She has your eyes," Elara said. "She has your expression." He traced the edge of the baby's jaw with one careful finger. "She's going to be formidable." "Of course she is." Elara leaned her head back against the pillow. "She's ours." And Clara Austin came to visit 2 days after the birth, bringing bread and news from the school. She sat by the bed and held little Clara with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this many times, and she looked at Elara with the expression of someone who is about to say something true. "You look different," she said. "I've just had a baby. I look terrible." "You look happy." Clara rocked the infant gently. "Not just today. I've been watching you this whole year. You look like someone who found out the ground was still there." Elara considered this. "That's accurate," she said. "You know what I think?" Clara didn't wait for an answer. "I think you had already started to make your peace with it not being there, with the ground giving way. I think you'd already started to let go." Elara was quiet. "And then the storm," Clara said. "And then him." She nodded toward the sounds of Declan in the kitchen making coffee, moving with the familiar quiet efficiency that Elara had stopped noticing because it had become ordinary, and ordinary was what she had wanted. "He fixed things," Elara said. "He came in and fixed things." "No," Clara said. "He came in and let you fix things. There's a difference. Everything you've built this year, the farm, the school that was already in you, he just made it possible to reach it." Elara looked at her daughter, small and warm and particular in Clara's arms. "When did you get so wise?" she said. "Third year of widowhood," Clara said. "You get a lot of thinking done." They sat together in the winter light, the baby sleeping between them, and outside the school stood on the corner of the property with its 4 good windows and its full benches, and the fields rested under snow that would melt in spring to water the wheat they were already planting. And in the kitchen, Declan was making coffee the way he made it every morning, too strong, black, the kind that made you feel more alive whether you wanted to be or not. The spring came as it always did, without much ceremony. The snow retreated, the soil emerged, the crocus pushed through the mud in the kitchen garden, and after the crocus, the marigolds, and after the marigolds, everything else a cascade of color, where the previous year there had been only struggling necessity. Elara stood in her flower garden on a morning in April, Clara on her hip, the baby batting at the bright yellow heads of the marigolds with the concentrated interest of someone discovering that the world contains infinite things worth touching, and looked at what they had made. The farm was stable, not prosperous, not yet, but stable, the mortgage current, the soil productive, the livestock healthy and growing. The school had 12 students and a waiting list, and 2 families from the far side of the county had written to ask if she could take their children in the fall. She had written back saying yes, and then gone home and told Declan they needed to expand the building. "I know," he'd said. He'd already sketched the addition. She thought, standing in there in the morning light with her daughter in her arms and the smell of growing things all around her, about the woman who had knelt in the snow the previous February, who had told herself to get up or die there. She thought about the cold stone weight in her chest and the pitchfork in her hands and the shadow in the barn and the voice low and rough and careful, saying, "I mean no harm." She thought about all the moments in the chain that had led here, each one small enough to have gone differently, each one a door she might have kept closed. The barn door that had banged in the storm, the horse trembling, the choice that had felt like nothing more than the inability to do otherwise. She heard Declan's footsteps on the path behind her and didn't turn. He came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders and looked out at the garden with her. The baby, noticing him, reached in his direction with the imperious certainty of someone who knows they will be picked up if they ask. He picked her up. "The East Field is ready to plant," he said. "I was thinking we start tomorrow." "Good. And the Hendersons stopped while you were with the students. They want to buy our excess seed." Said they've been watching our yield and want to know what we're doing differently. What did you tell them? That we work hard and pay attention. A pause. And that the farmer's better at it than I am. She turned to look at him. He was holding Claire against his shoulder, the baby's small fist wrapped around his collar, his expression easy and warm in the morning light. I love you, she said. It still surprised her slightly how simple that had become, how uncomplicated, how unlike all the careful transactions of feelings she'd spent her life navigating. I know, he said. Then I love you. Clara made a sound of general agreement and grabbed his ear. Elara took her daughter back and turned toward the cabin. The marigolds were orange and gold in the morning light. The wheat field was the particular tender green of something just beginning. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of the property with its south-facing windows, waiting for Monday. Some storms, her mother used to say, bring death. Some bring rain, and some the ones you can't predict, the ones that come up faster than anyone expects, the ones that strip away everything you thought was necessary and leave you standing in the cold with nothing between you and the world. Some of those bring something else entirely. She had thought, standing at the door of her barn with a pitchfork in her hands and a stranger in the shadows, that the storm had brought her to the edge of everything. She had been right, it had. The edge, it turned out, was where the new thing started. She went inside. Declan followed. The door closed behind them on a morning that was warm enough finally to leave the draft behind and inside the cabin that had been built by a man who saw her as equipment and that had been filled since then with laughter and argument and the smell of coffee too strong for ordinary people. And that had walls now carrying the accumulated weight of a year of being genuinely lived in. Inside all of that, they started the next day. The wheat was already growing. The school was full. The baby was learning her father's laugh. And somewhere outside, almost ready, but not quite the first of the flowers Elara had planted, purely for beauty, were about to open, the ones she'd put in that cold March afternoon when she had decided quietly and without announcement that survival was not going to be enough anymore. She had decided she was going to live. She did.
Nathan.
By the time Claire was 3 months old, Elara had developed the ability to teach while holding a sleeping infant, which she counted among the more useful skills she had ever acquired. The baby had strong opinions about being set down and no particular interest in modifying them on behalf of arithmetic lessons. And so arithmetic lessons happened with small Clara attached to her mother's front in a carrier Declan had rigged from canvas and rope based on something he'd seen on his travels. The students found this fascinating. Jacob Danner, Margaret's 12-year-old, who had a mathematical mind that ran faster than Elara could quite keep up with, asked if he could hold the baby during geography, and she handed Clara over with the calculation that if he was holding an infant, he was less likely to be doing the mental equivalent of running laps while she tried to explain the difference between a territory and a state. This proved correct. Clara slept through the entire geography lesson. Jacob memorized all the territories. Declan came to the schoolhouse door one afternoon and stood watching without coming in, the way he sometimes did when he didn't want to interrupt but wanted to see. Elara was at the board, chalk in hand, demonstrating a long division problem, while 4 students copied it into their slates and 2 younger ones worked on letters with the focused intensity of children who understand that they are doing something important. She didn't notice him until she turned to ask a question and found him leaning against the door frame with an expression she had come to think of as the undone look. One that appeared when he'd stopped managing what was on his face because something had bypassed all his management. "You're very good at this," he said when the lesson broke for the noon meal. "I know," she said without false modesty. "I was born to teach. It just took circumstances to show me so." "Terrible circumstances." "Yes." She looked out at the students filing outside. "But they brought me here. I don't know how to fully regret them." He stood beside her in the doorways of the schoolhouse, the 2 of them looking out at the students eating their lunches on the grass, the fields beyond the cabin at the top of the slope, the property that had been a year ago a failing homestead on the edge of foreclosure. That was today a place. "You saved yourself," and he said. "I want to be clear about that. I helped where I could, but you—" "We," she said. "Elara." "We," she said again. "I won't let you minimize what you did. You showed up in a blizzard and stayed in a barn and fixed a roof you didn't have to fix. You spent your savings on seed for land that wasn't yours. You took work to make a mortgage payment that had nothing to do with you." She turned to look at him. "I was surviving before you came." "That's true. But surviving and living are different things, and you know it." He held her gaze. The undone look was still there, but with something else layered under it now. Something that looked like gratitude, which was interesting because she'd thought she was the grateful one. All right, he said. We, she confirmed and went back to the students. The first snow of this new winter came in November, which was early but not unprecedented, and it came gently large soft flakes that drifted down without urgency, covering the harvested fields in white. Elara stood at the kitchen window watching it and felt for the first time in her memory no dread. She had made her list. She ticked through it the way she always had, with the methodical attention to inventory she developed out of necessity and kept out of habit. Food in the root cellar more than they'd ever had, the summer's production supplemented by what the southeast field had given them under the Danners' steady work. Firewood stacked head high along the barn wall. Bessie and the new heifer they'd bought in September, both healthy, already adjusted to the cold. Seeds saved and labeled and stored for spring. The schoolhouse shuttered for the season, with the understanding that lessons would continue in the cabin, which was warmer and where most of the students now felt comfortable anyway. Mortgage current. Bank satisfied, or as near to satisfied as Arthur Pemberton was capable of being about anything. She thought about the woman who had stood at this same window a year ago, looking out at the storm and calculating how long she had left. She thought about the pitchfork, the shadow, the voice. "It's starting early," Declan said behind her, coming to stand at her shoulder and look out at the snow. "I know." She leaned slightly into him. "We're all right, though." "We are," he put his arm around her. "Clara, sleeping." She nodded toward the room where the baby's small snores could occasionally be detected. "She slept through her first storm last month, and I don't think she's been troubled by bad weather since. She may have your equanimity, or your practicality, or both." Elara watched a flake land on the window and melt. "She's going to be remarkable." "She already is." They were quiet for a moment. The snow came down outside, covering the garden. The marigolds were long past now, dead back to the ground, but the lavender had held its structure and stuck up through the first light, covering like a pale gray architecture. In the spring it would come back. She had learned this year to count on that, on the things that would come back. "I've been thinking," Declan said. "Tell me." "The Danner land they have asked if they can stay on next year. Margaret wants to build something more permanent than the Sadi." "Of course they should stay. And the Austin boy James, he's been asking about apprenticing on the farm, learning properly with intention to run his own place someday." "James is sharp," Elara said. "I've been watching him in school. He understands systems, how things connect." She paused. "Are you thinking about taking him on?" "Thinking about it." He paused. "This place is becoming something on," he said. "More than just a farm. The school, the Danners, the people who stop by now. It's becoming a community," she said. Yes, she thought about that. About the way things had been in November, the isolation, the silence, the sense of being utterly alone in a world that was indifferent to whether she survived. She thought about how that had changed, not all at once, but gradually, one connection at a time. "Clara Austin told me something," she said, "when she came after the baby was born. She said it was how things get better, not all at once, just one person at a time doing the same thing for the next one." "She's right." "Yes." Elara watched the snow. "I went through something that almost ended me. And instead of ending me, she paused, looking for the word. "It opened something. I couldn't see anything from that low except how far up there was to go." And she turned to look at him, at the man who had been a shadow in her barn, a strange voice in the dark who had shown her his hands and waited for her to decide. "And I found something worth building toward," she said. "That's all? That's everything." He kissed her forehead, then her temple. Then, because Clara had stopped snoring, and they both knew what that meant, he went to check on the baby, and Elara turned back to the window and watched the snow coming down soft and unhurried, covering everything with patient grace. Outside, the lavender stood in its small gray architecture waiting for spring. Inside, she heard Declan making the small sounds of a man picking up his daughter, and then the low murmur of his voice saying something too quiet to make out from the kitchen, and then rising above it, unmistakable and clear, the sound of Clara laughing.